I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Gerald Q. Maguire, Jr., Professor Emeritus at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden and Fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. Dr. Maguire has a bachelor's in physics from the Indiana University of Pennsylvania and 2 PhD degrees in computer science from the University of Utah. He's also been a Gauss professor with Technische Universität Graz and a program director for experimental systems at the U.S. National Science Foundation. His research interests include mobile computing and communication systems, networking, picture archiving, and communication. So Gerald, welcome. Today we are discussing themes from your paper, Becoming Borg to Become Immortal, Regulating Brain Implant Technologies, published in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics. So you published this paper several years ago, but recent advances in implants make it more relevant than ever before. So let me start out by asking, what was your initial inspiration to write this?
Well, in the beginning of the 1990s, particularly inspired by Richard Norman's Utah array, I was thinking about implantables as being the next obvious thing after wearables. Because I was very involved in communications, it was pretty obvious, particularly here in Sweden, that wireless communications were going to be really important, or at least so the Ericsson and Televerket, later Telia, and the Posten Telestyrelse in Sweden thought it would be important, so they had created this professorship at KTH, and I got it. And I was very frustrated because I couldn't get people, particularly in industry, to talk about the ethical issues about these implantables. And there were even companies who basically said, no, you cannot use these particular parts in anything involving life care, implantation, etc., etc. And I was at dinner with my wife and the McGees, and Ellen McGee is an ethicist. And in particular, she's focused on bioethics and medical ethics. And I expressed my frustration to her, and she said, this is a good idea, we should explore it. And that led to a series of papers, starting with a paper around 1999. But the interesting thing is, I'm not an ethicist, I'm a computer scientist, but working with an ethicist, it really helped awaken for me some better understanding about the fact that it's not a very clear discrimination between therapeutic or applications like that and things that could be enhancements. So for instance, I'm colorblind. So if I could see color, is that an enhancement or is that recovering from a deficiency? Well, for the equipment to do that, if I have a camera that's assisting me in doing that and providing the information about color, well, I could similarly have infrared, ultraviolet, perhaps even X-ray. Where is the boundary? And there's no real clear boundary. And I think that was sort of what got me started in this.
Well, again, you were so far ahead of the curve when you published this paper. It came out originally in 2007. Again, in the paper, you referenced an earlier paper from 1999. And so these ethical issues are something that you have been following and covering and talking about for, a couple of decades now. And the length of time was particularly interesting to me, partly because, again, you were so far out in front of the curve there, but also you've had the time to be able to kind of watch things move forward. So in the 2007 paper, back then you described the rate of development of these new technologies as breathtaking. What are your thoughts on the advances that have happened since that time?
Well, I thought in those 8 years between those two papers that things had really developed tremendously, both on the technology side and importantly, the 1999 paper, it appeared in 2 textbooks that are widely used by colleges in the U.S. on ethics. And I thought that was sort of going, as it were, mainstream. It's sort of what we hope for, is to foster people actually talking about it. And only, we thought, if people really talk about it, will these issues come out and start to get addressed, both in the general public, but also by lawmakers, regulators, etc. And if there's a big interest in these sorts of things, we know in the end, almost all of these technologies will end up getting regulated in some fashion. Where will it be? And that'll be driven by what do people think. What's the general ethos about these sort of technologies? Is it something where we know we have to ban it at all costs? Or is it something where we say, well, we accepted all sorts of implants? And the short list from the paper, we have, everything from breast implants, penile implants, to cochlear implants, to retinal, all kinds of different things that have been done. And we have people who are interested in body modification as a means of enhancing their persona, what they want to be. And we have the people for whom it gives them an edge. If I have this particular technology available to me, it simplifies my life in some way or gives me an advantage of doing some things in life, perhaps personally or professionally. So Dr. McGee in a lot of her talks about the fact that a problem that it comes up with this is renorming. Does it become the new normal?
Yeah.
And this is a very hard problem because, again, when you have this no clear boundary between is it a appliance that helps you recover from what some would view as a deficiency or an enhancement, where in that is the world? And particularly if it becomes an issue with regard to who can afford it and not afford it, is this yet another thing that is a negative aspect that only the rich can have these implants?
And, if I can jump in, you're touching on so many, a lot of these are things that I come back to in my questions, but so many of these important aspects of it. So when you talked about renorming, I want to read off a short list of enhancements, augmentations to the human body, which includes braces, glasses, artificial hips, pacemakers, IUDs, as well as tattoos, makeup and lipstick, circumcision, vaccinations, tonsillar appendix removals, hormone replacement therapy, and plastic surgery. And these are all body modifications or augmentation. And so it's interesting because I believe you'd mentioned subdermal implants. People have been adding those lately. They go under the skin, they raise the skin, they can, look like a Vulcan or modify their appearance. A lot of people would say, well, that's strange, that's different, that's obviously a modification, okay? But something like a vaccination or a tonsillectomy, that would also be a modification. And in the case of vaccinations, those are often required by law, right? To join the military, take certain jobs, things like that.
And in some states, it's required if you want to attend a university that you actually have to have vaccination in New York State for German measles, etc.
Yeah, so it's become normal. That's what you're saying. This is that renorming process where things that we've looked at in the past, and said, wow, this is new and different and, it's way out there, have become just a part of our life, right? And like tattoos, I think, are one of those. In my lifetime, I've seen this. Tattoos were kind of verboten when I was a kid, right? It's the kind of thing that sailors and truck drivers got. And now everybody seems to have them. And so that is an example of body modification where it's gone mainstream and now it's normal. It's the new normal.
But you also touched there upon this issue about when it becomes required. And that's where it's, from an ethical and moral point of view, there are some real issues there, particularly with regard to who can require what of someone else to have this modification or change, particularly with regard to children or people who are unable to freely decide for themselves.
Well, so I want to go to brain implants. Last year, Neuralink implanted their first patient with a brain implant containing 64 flexible polymer threads that provided 1024 sites for recording brain activity. and it allowed the patient to control a computer mouse simply by thinking. And I've come to learn that that was not the first brain implant. They have a different design, but I believe there's a company called Synchron that has also created and placed brain implants in people. So this is a technology that is out there, and it is starting to see use, and it has a few different applications. I understand that it's being used to treat various metabolic disorders, as well as people who are paralyzed could move a mouse, and basically they're just seeing where can we apply this. Are brain implants different than other types of implants because they have the potential to change our self-identity, I guess?
I would say they're not really distinct from others, except in that with communication, it really means I'm not just here in a physical spot. I can virtually be elsewhere as part of me,
Okay.
even via others, potentially third parties participating in this. But I think going back in history, Gilles Bridley, who's of course famous for many, many things, did some of the earliest of this by implanting electrodes, each with a radio in them. So the result was, unlike the Utah array, where it was a fixed array, these could actually be placed in different spots. And that was already in the 60s. But I think the interesting thing about the Neuralink approach is different from the Utah array and other sorts of things, is this flexibility, the ability to potentially avoid the rejection and the problems associated with fixed arrays.
Okay.
The second thing was really their use of robotic surgery so as to potentially make the process faster, easier, and safer. Now, the Utah array, the approach was you basically just drilled a hole in the head and you blew it in under air pressure, and it penetrated, and then the electrodes were below the surface of the brain, and now you could read the activity that's there. But we also have non-implanted interfaces using what are called SQUIDs, or superconducting quantum interference devices, with electrodes placed outside the head that can actually measure the currents flowing in the brain along the neurons. So it isn't necessary that it be implanted. It's the fact that you have this interface. And for me, the most interesting thing is it's a two-way interface that can be learned. And so this issue of brain plasticity, of your brain being able to adapt to different activities, to loss of limbs, or as some people found, gaining a limb. So when I was at the University of Utah as a graduate student, we had people who had several left arms because strapped to their arm was a prosthetic arm, and they were learning to control this prosthetic arm using the signals in the shoulder to develop prosthetics for people who had lost limbs.
Okay.
And it's, to me, really fascinating because there's a sort of schism in this realm. There are the people who are very focused on remediation and understanding the brain so that they can overcome some physiologic problem or neurologic problem. And then there are people like me who really don't care about that. The more interesting thing to me is that you could learn to use this interface, just like you could learn to use Morse code, you could learn to use this interface. And now, because it's an interface and it can function in two ways, that's where the really interesting thing for me was.
Well, let me go into this idea of the Borg, I guess. Is becoming the Borg an inevitable part of humanity's future? Nearly all of our communication and information technologies have gotten smaller and more personal, and they are doing that very rapidly. So from smartphones in our pocket, health trackers on our wrist, AirPods in our ear, consumer demand has turned common devices into wearables. I'm wondering if it is going to drive them inside of our bodies.
I have said for a very, very long time, more than 20 years now, that that was more or less inevitable. For a number of reasons. One is, if you become dependent on this technology and you use it a lot, when would you want to be without it?
Yeah.
And the second aspect is with regard to energy. And so you can think with an implanted device, I can use much, much less power because the signals I have to produce are many, many orders of magnitude lower than what I have to drive a set of headphones or run a cell phone, etc. Now, with that, the question will be, what's the first communication link after that? So just like many people, there's a group, in fact, at the University of Washington near you that has done some very cool things by implanting in a plastic lens, as if it were for vision purposes, as a contact lens, a sensor to measure the sugar level in your blood.
Okay.
And so if someone is diabetic, and this is a good way to monitor it, but the interesting thing is this device is completely without power. It's powered from the Wi-Fi signals around you, and it takes those Wi-Fi signals in, and it recovers a little energy from that, and it modifies its antenna, and it backscatters a signal out that can be received. And so now the result is that this device that has no power is actually able to communicate the measurements to elsewhere. And that becomes very interesting because you can think of a lot of applications of this kind of technology. And then where does it get to? It gets to your cell phone, or it gets you to some other device that can relay the information on to wherever in the cloud you need to have it.
Yeah. And again, the communications aspect is what makes this so powerful. So I want to scroll back up to an earlier question, because you had written that in the paper, you wrote that the potential of brain implants to change and significantly affect humans is potentially far greater than that of genetic or drug enhancements, because implants open the door to new information, whereas genetics and drugs can only improve what's already there, right?
Yes. And I think that, as we've seen today, as people are spending huge amounts of money to train large language models, they're consuming vast amounts of information. That information is now embedded in that model. And therefore you can have services like ChatGPT, etc., where you can now query this. Well, think about an individual being able to do that without having to type on the keyboard or speak out loud, etc., where it's just there. Oh, I need this information. Oh, what's this person's name? I see them. Boom. I have the information about them, and I remember when was the last time I met them, but I wasn't remembering it. It was his computer, and it was data in a database that's being recalled for me and presented to me.
You know, and this goes to this idea of neuroplasticity and the mind expanding and adapting to communications interfaces that are there, right? I did an interview with a fellow named Amal Grafstra, and he actually runs a secure ID implant company. And one of the things he had speculated on was that the brain may actually start to offload processing or memory functions to the network. And then if that happens due to brain implants, there's another question of what happens to our self-identity when part of our quote-unquote self is in another place, and what happens if we're out of range of that signal, if the implant gets turned off?
Well, there are two components to that. One is, and I heard the interview that you did with him, for these identification type implants, a very big difficulty there is, how can I assert that I'm giving permission to use that at this point in time? So not just being present, but I'm actively saying, yes, I want to say yes, click my FIDO key or something like that to say, yes, I want to authenticate myself now. That's a really important thing. Here in Sweden, that's an essential part of contracts, that you have to understand it and you have to be able to affirmatively say yes or no. So there's this question about my control of it. Do I control it or does somebody else control it? And what level of control do I have? But you mentioned this problem of what happens if I don't have communications and I become dependent on that. And of course, there are going to be problems about withdrawal. Just the same as if I'm used to being able to feel things with my hand, and now I lose a hand or I damage my hand, I have a difficulty because I'm going to have to adapt to that. Now, it may be traumatic, and it may take a period of time, but I've gotten used to it. So of course I expect that it's going to continue to work. Now, fortunately, in most cases today, we have, at least at the emergency level, communications now starting to happen between cell phones and low Earth orbit satellites.
Yeah.
So the number of places that you could be where you truly wouldn't have a very, very minimal ability to communicate is becoming rarer and rarer. And that's quite a significant change.
Well, and that's good. This brings up so many gray areas, right? I mean, right now, if you go out of cell phone range, you lose the ability to, potentially call emergency services, which is why they've added those SOS satellite functions to some phones. But then there's this other idea of what happens if you go out of range and you lose your childhood. That idea of brain implants being that connected is, breathtaking in good and bad ways.
But we have people, for instance, who, because of disease, difficulties, lose the ability to remember things.
Yeah.
So the result is they only have their temporary memories. And I was reading recently about someone being interviewed, and the person saying to them, "I won't remember you after you leave." All they could remember was their childhood, and all of the things that they knew at that time they could still recall, etc. But all the things that were happening in recent times, no short-term memory, getting turned into long-term memories.
This reminds me of Lawnmower Man in the movie, right? It was I believe they described him as a simpleton. It was someone with a below average IQ and ability to process information, right? He wasn't considered very socially smart. And as I recall in the movie, this was someone who had been made fun of. He had been, socially ostracized for that. And through the combination in that movie, they hypothesized, I believe it was drugs and electronic education would do the trick. They made him into something that was far beyond normal intelligence and memory, right? And so in a sense, that parable may apply to brain implants as well, right? We could take someone who has damaged memory recall, and that could come from senility, normal aging, all sorts of different causes. And we could bring them up to normal, or as you said, we could take them far beyond normal and give them what we might think of now as superhuman powers. And so there's a real gray area there.
But it touches upon this point that I raised of who decides that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned they did this. And that's a very hard problem when the they is someone else who decides a modification to your body. And that's where as an individual, I have a real problem with other people deciding what I should do, particularly with my body. So I think that's a real sensitive area. The problem is that there are in many cases where there's a belief either a society or a part of a society or even a legal requirement which forces these sort of changes. So think of a parent who's now willing to spend huge amounts of money to get their child into the right school. Well, does that mean a neuroprosthetic? Okay, fine, so that's some more money. They were paying for tutors in any case, etc. There's not a nice clear boundary there where you can say, oh no, you shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, and so you're talking about basically a caste system of haves and have-nots, where augmented people may have abilities that are considered essential for, the high-paying jobs and the leadership roles in society. People who can't afford that, who maybe come from impoverished families, may be just hung out to dry. I think that's kind of what you're going towards.
One part of it, but there's the other side to it, which is, could society force parents to enhance their children, to bring them up to a particular level. So when I was young, my father was a junior high school principal, and at the time Pennsylvania had passed a new law about mainstreaming of children in school. So rather than having students separated off in a special education class who had learning difficulties, they were to be included in the classes with everyone else. And except if they were more than one difficulty. And so it becomes, again, a slippery slope on the other side as to what level you say you need to or you must have this enhancement or this change. It's the same reason why, as my colleague Dr. McGee often talks about in her presentations, the deaf community is very much against cochlear implants.
Okay.
Because they don't see that deafness is a deficiency. It's not a deficiency to them. And I think an interesting thing here in where I live in Stockholm is sign language is fairly popular. There are many people, even who are not deaf, who speak sign language. And sign language is a so-called first language for many people. And therefore it must be protected the same as other first languages like Swedish and the so-called minority languages.
Okay.
It's not a deficiency. So this community views it as there's not a problem with deafness.
Yeah. It is a component of their personality as well as part of their culture, and it is a permanent fixture in their world, I guess.
Yes,
and that's threatened.
It threatens the community. So to what extent would we see the potential for laws saying, no, but we know how to do this, we know how to remediate this, you must have this so that we can more easily mainstream you into what we think is the path that everyone should be on?
Well, one of the things that I saw here in the United States, and I think that this is still continuing, and it's very controversial, is the diagnosis of disorders like ADHD, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not a doctor, and so I'm going to go with the medical establishment and assume that lots and lots of people have this. But by the same token, from what I've heard, a lot of people are basically being diagnosed using rather questionable criteria. And the reasoning behind that is it's easier to get them in, get them out, and give them a drug than to actually deal with the issue. Okay. And so, again, with ADHD, that's the kind of thing where they send them home with pills. If they take them, good. If they decide not to, it's their choice. With the brain implant, if we end up with something similar, if Billy goes into the doctor and the doctor says, Billy, you need an implant because your math scores are too low, that is a dangerous gray area. And it goes to the same thing as the cochlear implant, but to me, the cochlear implant seems clear-cut, right? Deafness is maybe more binary in some ways than emotional instability issues, which could be a natural part of age.
But we have people who get implants to deal with things like Parkinson's disease and the inability to control of their muscles. And so there are implants that have been developed to help people for this. And one of my former students has had a long life as a diabetic with an implanted insulin pump, etc., and now has Parkinson's. Would he be someone that they would say, oh, he should have this? And this saying should, that's where, as I say, I have a problem of the individual should make the decision about, shall I have this implant therapy, whatever, whether it's a therapy or an enhancement.
That's an excellent point. And when you mentioned Parkinson's, I had seen the videos, I believe there's another condition as well, where the people have tremors and they've used implants to suppress those tremors. And it was mind-blowing. It was transformative for the person's life. I mean, absolutely transformative. You would look at that and say, this is miracle medicine, right? So there is, far more than a silver lining to it, right? This is the future in many ways.
But again, there will be these issues about equity. Who will pay? Will it be only those who can afford to pay? Will we have government programs that will say, oh yes, we're going to pay? Or will we have government initiatives that say, you must have this because it makes it easier for us to have the society that they've decided we should have?
Well, another aspect of brain implants, especially when you're getting into things like communication, right? Processing and memory, to me it seems like that could potentially change self-identity, right? And that seems like the core of what makes us us. And so, like you'd mentioned, wanting the person to give permission, but then the question becomes, which person should be giving permission? Is it the the pre-augmented person who may not be able to even understand the permission they're giving, or is the post-augmented person who may be terrified of losing those abilities, right? So again,
Yes.
giant gray area.
Well, one of the points that we brought out in the 2007 paper was, let's say that you're a pilot, and at that point in time, it cost about $1 million to train a pilot. And yet, a difficulty is a pilot who's controlling things with their hands, they can only move their fastest finger at about 15 hertz. But they can think about moving that finger faster.
Okay.
So you could think about saying, oh, we do an implant, we save a $100 million aircraft, and we save the life of a pilot that we've invested $1 million in. What's an extra $250,000? Plus the training time and all of that investment to it. Okay, you might say this is a really good thing. If I'm a pilot and it improves my chance of surviving, sure, I might say yes. But then what happens when they leave the service? Is this turned off? And that's going to be very difficult because you now have someone who it's become a part of them in their life, the way that they interact with things. They're used to having this. And now the question is it the right or wrong thing to force them to turn it off? Because removing the implants is generally very, very difficult. My wife and I have worked with a lot of orthopedic surgeons, and they say the first surgery is the only ever one that's easy. After that, it's very, very difficult because the scar tissue and all of these sorts of problems. So removing implanted things, you will not want to be casually doing.
Well, I want to return to the title, Becoming Borg to Become Immortal. Let's touch on the immortal part of this. One path to immortality is replacing organic pieces bit by bit. And I think that society has already started down that road today, right? Things like hips and heart valves, and soon we will have 3D printed organs, all of these various pieces that we're just, taking out as they become defective and replacing them like parts of a car. Another path is uploading our consciousness. And I don't think that we are at that point yet, but as brain implants mature, I think that we may reach a point where that becomes possible. That was, I think the grand conclusion of Lawnmower Man was the augmented person decides that they're better without a body at all. And he uploads himself into the internet or the network or whatever it was at the time. So to me, these seem like two sides of the same coin in terms of self-identity. If you replace enough bits and pieces, it seems like the self no longer remains, whereas if you upload the self, the body no longer remains, although the self is preserved, right?
Well, when I was growing up in Pennsylvania, there was this famous sort of story about Washington's axe, and they'd changed the handle 5 times, they'd replaced the head 3 times. Was it still Washington's axe? And that's sort of this same issue. Is the individual still the same individual? After you've replaced all their different parts, after you've perhaps, as Bob Metcalfe, the inventor of the Ethernet, said in a talk at MIT, upload yourself to become immortal, because we know there was a project at DARPA and there was a guy at Microsoft who was recording everything that he saw and heard.
Okay.
And the idea was that if you could record all of those things, you had all the information that someone had been exposed to. It could be available to them in the future, even a virtual them. And that's this uploading. If everything that I see, hear, touch, interact with, etc., I can somehow preserve all of that, then did I need the body? Well, not really. But then a thing that we also raised as an issue was what happens now when I clone myself, and there's another me, and now that me has access to all of my memories, all the things that I saw, heard, etc., experienced. Are they a copy of me? Are they a different me? And what happens if both of us are alive at the same time?
Yeah.
So how many me's can there be? And I think that's where it gets to be really very, very, very complex. And I don't think as a society we're yet to that point where we could deal with the fact that there could be multiple me's.
Do you think that we're already starting to travel down this road? One of the things in your bio, it talked about basically doing preservation of photography and documents and things like that. I do photography. That's my hobby. And there is this element of capturing reality and digitally uploading it, right? And so, in a sense, it almost seems like this uploading process may already be starting. We already may be seeing the glimmers of what could potentially be a future hive mind, could potentially be virtual immortality, things like that. It's not there yet, but perhaps we're seeing just a little bit of it.
Well, I think one of the most impressive things to me was many years ago, I visited the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and went into the computer science building, and I knew where everything was, and I'd never been there before.
Okay.
Because I had experienced the 3D CAD models of it, and this change in feeling when you know where things are, even though I haven't been there before, is incredible. So there are people who've done this with Aspen, for instance, where they went and every short distance took pictures in several different seasons, and then enabled people to be able to explore the town before going there. And they could say, oh, what's it going to be like in the winter, the spring? Is this a place I want to live? Oh, I know it's there, etc. And I have a colleague who was very involved in digitization of things and was inventor of one of the scanners at Hewlett-Packard for being able to just run this thing over a piece of paper and digitize it. And he asked the question of what would happen if I basically took all the digital pictures that people were taking and uploaded them and then started building 3D models of this. And as you may know, there's some people who did this for Rome. They took an enormous collection of pictures and they're able to basically build from just, I think, 1 day's worth or 1 week's worth of pictures, a complete model of the city in 3D.
Yeah.
And that changes things tremendously. If you can then experience that before you go and visit Rome, well, I know where things are. I feel much more comfortable in that setting. And that's what happens when you start to have access to all of this information and have all of these pictures that people have been taking madly everywhere.
Well, and I think that we may have far more of that in the near future. And the reason I say that is I've started using AI tools. And one of the things that I found, and this is across the board, like photographs as well as text and written documents and things like that, they are able to search and correlate and basically put things together that are already out there, right? And so these photographs of Aspen that you mentioned, how many thousands or millions of other photos are there of Aspen that these AI tools will probably soon be able to stitch together, right? So the information is there. I think that we may see, again, just glimmers, but more and more of this progressing in the future before we reach the implant part of things.
Yes. But until then, we're going to have, heads-up displays. We're going to have all of these other sorts of things. Again, it's not a nice, clean boundary where you can say, oh, it's only when it's going to be implanted, even. That's what I
Yeah.
think is really very interesting, is we've gone from it sort of having to be an implant, was the only way that you could think about having access to all of these things, to thinking about, well, actually, if a major sunglasses manufacturer company is now starting to build glasses that can project an image on the inside of the glass to the user, well, that's getting pretty close there. And this enters the mass market. Potentially there's an enormous change already that will be bringing to people and people's lives and the way they interact.
Well, another question, I think, is commercialization of this. And I mean, especially advertising. That's something that we've seen, it went from TV ads that were aired at regular intervals to computer ads that were all over web pages to ads on our smartphones. So then the question becomes, if we're using implants, or like you were talking about, a system that projects things directly into your retina, will there be laws and regulations preventing advertising, or will we have ads inside of our heads? Because that thought is absolutely terrifying.
Well, you know why one particular company has been very successful commercially is because they've been able to use the information they have about people to match advertising up to people, and therefore they offer free services, free, because basically you bought and paid for them already with your attention. Is it the individual choosing to pay and get it, or is it somebody else choosing that they get it because we get paid for the advertising to provide this to you? Can you say no? So you may remember there was a device called TiVo at one point in time, and one of the things that it enabled was not only nonlinear watching of material, so you could pre-record things and then watch it when you wanted, but also the ability to watch it non-linearly, so you could skip over the commercials, and they even had basically a skip the commercial button that knew how long a commercial was and would skip forward that amount of time. Well, think about the automated AI version of that can actually tell which are the commercials and automatically skip them for you. So we clearly already see this sort of thing appearing in browsers, in browser extensions, where they try to figure out which of these pop-ups do you really want to see and don't want to see. And we're now starting to get AI intermediaries controlling our desktop, so they can say, oh no, he's not interested in that, I'll just filter it away. It starts to become very interesting.
Yeah. Advertising in many ways has become kind of a battlefield, right? Where you have one side coming out with better ad blockers, and the other side is finding better ways to get around them, And the other thing that I'm seeing, and this goes to AI, is I have pop-ups on several different websites saying, can we use your blog articles to train our AI? Can we use your podcast videos to train our AI? And in those cases, my thought is, sure, why not? It's public anyways. But if I had one of those inside of my head, I would feel very upset. Can we use your childhood to train our AI? That, again, is terrifying.
But perhaps not as terrifying as some of the other things that might occur with this. Can we basically use your body and your feelings and so forth to train our AI? Not just your memories of them, but actually use your body.
Yeah. Well, and then this, I think, past a certain point, this also goes to this question of like policing and search warrants and things like that, right? If you can look inside of a person's brain, you could determine guilt or innocence, or at least perceptual guilt or innocence for a specific crime. But then there's this other question of what other things have they done in their life? And if you find those while you're in there, can you hold them accountable for it, or should that be off limits? So lots and lots of gray areas.
Yes, well, sadly, that's an area that is because of the set of laws that there was a book that used to refer to 3 felonies a day, that there's almost certainly some set of laws that you've broken in the last 24 hours. If we just searched enough for it and had enough data, we'd be able to arrest you for this, that, or the other thing. At some point, it just becomes a question of, can you avoid the attention enough so that it doesn't happen to you? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's why lawfare became such a big thing in its use in
politics.
The last several years in politics. I think it's a very slippery slope that when you start going down that, because it can be applied to basically anyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it goes to this idea of, and this would be a separate discussion, but I know teachers and many other professionals are what they call mandatory reporters. And so there are certain things that if you learn about those, you're required to report them to the police, you know. And that's something that I'm okay with. I think that there are some things where if a person goes in to have their brain implant tuned up and they find out that the person has been engaged in X, Y, or Z, there are certain things where that person probably should be held accountable because they could be a danger to society, to children, to themselves, to lots of different things.
But unfortunately, we've often used this legal thought of, oh, it is being done to prevent child abuse, or it's being done to prevent fraud, or it's being done to suddenly now start to really be invasive in various people's lives. So if you look at the set of things that are mandatory to report, if you go to a hotel, according to the Federal Consumer Protection Board, you will be shocked at the amount of detail that has to be revealed. The license plate of your car, all kinds of things like that. And this is being reported to, yes, a commercial company that operates this database for the government, but they're a commercial company.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's interesting. This is a very, very interesting gray area, and you know these debates are happening right now before we get into implant territory. One of the things that I have been going back and forth on, this goes, I think, to the privacy issue, is I've been considering switching to proton meal, right, out of CERN, because it is privacy centric. And there's this part of me that feels like, you know, having the government snoop through my Gmail is offensive on some level. But then there is this other aspect that's like, you know, I don't really have anything snoop worthy. So if I do go to this, what is the point? What's the hassle? And I think that makes me a pretty average person. I think that most of us have to make that decision where we want our privacy, but really we're all engaged in the same stuff, or at least most of us are. Right.
Well, for 30 years, I was a civil servant, and all of my email was subject to discovery. And so I taught my students that email's forever. You never should write anything in email that you wouldn't want to see on, in our case, Expressen, which is one of the newspapers, in the afternoon. In headlines there, just don't put it in email.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was important, and there were some people who, for instance, we had a head of a school who wanted to go to Slack for command and control reasons so that she could give orders and it would process down and everyone would know about it, etc. But she wanted Slack to automatically delete everything after some number of months. And that way it's not a permanent record and it's not discoverable. Whereas any other communications that we had at the university, these are all discoverable because they're public acts. You're a public servant. Therefore, in the Swedish model of openness, where there are only 8 things that are allowed to be secret, the result is it all should be public and transparent. But at the same time, I find it very difficult now. Sweden has become almost completely cashless. So the result is that if you go into a restaurant, in many cases, they will not take cash. If you go into a store to buy something, a hardware store or whatever, they will not take cash. There's only a handful of locations that I can go to nowadays and actually spend cash. The result is there's a complete paper trail of where someone was, what they did, in many cases, who they were with, and I think that's extremely dangerous if you put that in the hands of the government.
You know, that almost reminds me of a movie, I can't remember the name of it. I think it was called Paycheck with Ben Affleck. And he is a reverse engineer, and he has his memory wiped after he does the jobs. And I guess that's why he gets the big paycheck, right? And so in an implant-centric society, maybe that's what we'll end up doing, is to preserve that privacy and anonymity for some things. Maybe people will resort to having memories wiped.
Well, one of my students did a project once for France Telecom concerning the tariffs that they pay. And as you know, their international calls have one set of tariffs, domestic calls have different sets of tariffs. But, for instance, if you called from France to the UK, you could have a time-based difference in the tariffs depending on whether the call originated in France or originated in England, because they're in two different time zones. So carefully exploiting these tariffs is an incredible area. And a requirement when she took the job, which she did for a thesis project, was that she could not work for any of their competitors for 3 years.
Yeah, and that's fairly conventional.
Yes.
So in that case, they're making an assumption that the technology will change enough after 3 years that it will no longer be relevant, right?
That's correct. But as you know, in California, for instance, there have been lawsuits over the knowledge that you gain while working for an employer. Can you use that for another employer? And you might, in many cases, have a non-competition clause in your contract that says, no, you can't go to the competitor, etc. But a very fascinating thing that the courts found was that you can use your knowledge of what didn't work.
Ah, okay.
Because that's part of your experience. If you're an engineer, oh, I tried this, I tried that, I learned these things from doing this. This one was the one that was successful. The company decided to go with that. I can't talk about that. But I know about all of these things that didn't work, and that's often more valuable even than knowing what it was that worked, because that product is out.
Well, so in terms of legal precedent, it sounds like that knowledge is not yours. It belongs to the company because it's their intellectual property. So then an extension of that would be, are they able to go in and delete it?
Yes.
Yeah, and again, absolutely terrifying. The idea in Paycheck was that he was deleting that himself, and he had some control over it, right? But the idea of someone else going in and deleting information, and you would have no memory of it after the fact. That would be the whole point. So you wouldn't even know if they had deleted too much.
No, and the difficulty would be if that was part of the legal contract when you did the job, and you agreed to it, then it would be an enforceable contract matter that, yes, they had the right to have you delete it. So as you may know, there's a fascinating book that was written with regard to the legal right of a court to order that, in this case it was TiVo-like devices, software be changed after the consumer had bought them. So when the device calls up and checks in periodically and looks, is there a software update? What it gets this time is a software downgrade and removes the functionality. Well, think about that for your implant. Suddenly, these things that were there and functions that you had, and perhaps you had even paid for having these functions, now gets removed because the court somewhere has decided that no, that function infringes on someone's patent or whatever, and I'm ordering that all that functionality be erased. It could be very bad.
Yeah. Suddenly, a person could lose intrinsic parts of self-identity, or at the very least, they could lose skills or abilities that have become part of them. So lots and lots and lots of gray areas.
But that's why it's important, I think, for people to talk about this in advance, so that we can build a sense of society of what is acceptable and not acceptable.
Well, Gerald, let me thank you so much for your time today. It was such a true pleasure and honor having you on, being able to touch on these issues. So I want to close by asking, what is coming up for you as we get into 2025 in the first few months of the year? And do you expect to see anything happening in the implant world by the same time?
Well, I don't really follow the implant world. That's not the area that I do research in, but a related thing, which I do research about, and I think is going to be very important, is this idea of being able to communicate in latent space. So if you look at large language models, if you took a transformer models, at some point we've gone in the middle of this model to some latent space. And what happens when you start to be able to communicate in that latent space? And so there's a paper recently called DroidSpeak, talks about a system called DroidSpeak, where a set of experts are able to communicate by exchanging the latent space encoded material. And I think a really interesting thing for implants will be, can we make use of that to overcome the limitations in the bandwidth and the speed of these interfaces? Because basically nerves only fire so fast. You only have so many electrodes. So I have a very limited amount of information that I can communicate if we measured in bits. But I can think about, if I had the right encoding of that material, overcoming those limitations. So when I taught courses about voice over IP long ago, I said, think about a custom-made codec for you, that if I'm going to place a call to you, you get a copy of my decoder, and now I send very, very few bits over the channel to your decoder, but it reproduces my voice in 48 kilohertz, audio, 16-bit samples, all of that, because the model has this information in it. And we have now seen with generative AI the ability that's being used in a massive way now to provide very little bits in and get a very rich scene out for images, audio, etc. Can we do the same kind of thing potentially for these implant interfaces into a human body? And that, I think, will be quite exciting. But first we need to figure out how to do it for AI.
Amazing, amazing. Gerald, let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
You're welcome. Have a wonderful 2025.